Snow lay thick across the sleeping town of Rosehill, cloaking its narrow streets in silver silence. The wind hummed low through the alleys, carrying with it the scent of pine and cold iron. Inside a small shop called Thread of Grace, a single golden lamp glowed against the frostbitten window panes. At the counter, Sandra Whitlow, a 24-year-old seamstress, was sweeping the last bits of thread from the floor. Her fingers were roughened from years of sewing, the kind of hands that told stories of work and quiet endurance. Soft curls of platinum hair escaped from the ribbon that held them back, and though her eyes were tired, they still carried warmth, the kind that could melt a stranger's sorrow. It was almost midnight when she reached to turn off the final lamp. Then she heard it, faint at first, like a whimper carried by the wind. She froze. Another cry followed. Sandra's heart stuttered. She moved toward the sound, her boots whispering across the old wooden floor. It came again, thin, desperate, alive. She pushed open the back door, and the winter air cut through her coat like knives. Outside, the alley lay still, the ground blanketed with white. But near the stack of firewood, something stirred. Sandra stepped forward cautiously, the snow crunching beneath her heels. And then she saw it. A wicker basket, half buried under drifting snow. Her breath caught. She dropped to her knees and brushed the flakes away with trembling hands. Inside were two newborn babies, swaddled tightly in deep purple velvet. Their tiny faces were flushed from the cold, their mouths open in weak cries that shattered the silence. Each baby wore a small silver pendant, a delicate leaf engraved on its surface. And tucked between the blankets was a torn photograph, the face of a smiling woman, only half visible. No note. No names. No explanation. Sandra looked around the alley, her breath rising in clouds. There were no footprints, no shadows, only the wind. The baby's cries softened into whimpers, as if waiting for her to decide their fate. For a moment she stood frozen, her mind torn between reason and instinct. She should call someone, report it, do what any sensible person would. But she didn't move. Because in the next heartbeat, one of the infants reached out blindly, her tiny fingers curling around Sandra's thumb. Something inside her broke open. A sound escaped her throat, a half sob, half gasp. It felt as though a thread had been sewn straight into her heart, pulling her toward them, binding her to these fragile souls she had never seen before. Sandra lifted the basket carefully, gathering both babies against her chest. They were impossibly small, yet their warmth spread through her like a promise. She looked up into the gray, endless sky and whispered, voice trembling. "From now on, I'll be the thread that keeps you together." Then she turned back inside, closing the door softly behind her as the snow continued to fall. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months of paperwork, phone calls, and whispered prayers. The local authorities found no trace of family, no one claiming two lost infants. And so, by the mercy of law and love, Sandra Whitlow became the legal guardian of the twin girls she had found on that freezing night. She named them Aria and Lyra, names she'd once saved in a small notebook of dreams she never expected to use. Aria, the older by a few minutes, was delicate and dreamy. She loved to hum as she drew, scribbling on the backs of fabric scraps with colored pencils. Lyra was the opposite, curious, bold, and full of questions too big for her age. By the time she was 2, she had already tried to help stitch a sock, leaving Sandra in tears of laughter. Sandra sewed every little dress herself, soft cotton trimmed with lace and love. Each time the girls outgrew one, she folded it carefully and tucked it away in a wooden chest, as if saving chapters from a story that only she could read. Their days were simple, but full. Mornings began with cereal spills and giggles. Afternoons smelled of chalk dust and fabric dye. Evenings ended with lullabies and the hum of Sandra's sewing machine. Money was always tight, but warmth never was. Sandra's world, once lonely, now beat to the rhythm of two little hearts. She memorized every detail, Aria's favorite crayon, Lyra's half-peeled apples, the soft scent of their hair after bath time. She learned what silence meant before a storm of giggles, and what kind of hug could stop a nightmare. They were her entire world, and in every way that mattered, she was theirs. Yet, on quiet nights, when the shop was dark and the girls asleep, Sandra sometimes took out a small tin box hidden beneath her bed. Inside lay the 2 silver necklaces and the torn photograph. The leaf pendant still shimmered faintly in the lamplight. The woman's half-smile in the photo never changed, nor did the mystery of who she was. Sandra told herself it didn't matter. Love was enough. But love could not quiet curiosity forever. One afternoon, as Aria colored quietly beside Lyra, she looked up with wide, thoughtful eyes and asked, "Mommy, where's our daddy?" Sandra froze. The pencil dropped from her fingers. She turned, her breath caught between her ribs. Aria was watching her, so innocent, so trusting. Sandra knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "But you have me. You'll always have me." Aria nodded, her tiny face serious for a moment, then broke into a small smile as if that answer was enough. Sandra pressed a kiss to her forehead, whispering the words she had stitched into her soul long ago. "We're sewn together, my loves, and I'll never let you unravel." The town's community center shimmered with soft amber lights and laughter that floated like warm air in winter. White linens draped every table, crystal glasses caught the glow of chandeliers, and a faint melody from a string quartet filled the air. It was the Winter Hope Gala, an annual charity event for children in foster care. Sandra had been invited at the last moment to assist with tailoring and custom suit fittings for several distinguished guests. She had never attended such a grand affair before. But someone had recommended her work, and though she hesitated, part nerves, part humility, she accepted. Opportunities like this were rare, and she couldn't afford to turn one down. She brought Aria and Lyra with her. Leaving them behind felt unthinkable. Besides, the girls had begged to see the fancy people. They arrived in matching blush pink dresses Sandra had sewn herself, each trimmed with lace and embroidered flowers around the hem. Their golden curls were tied up in twin buns, and in their small hands they carried Ziploc bags filled with heart-shaped cookies they'd baked that morning. The twins stayed close to their mother's side, whispering in their secret twin language, giggling softly. Occasionally, they offered cookies to the sharply dressed guests who smiled down at them, enchanted. Wherever the girls went, warmth followed. Even among the polished crowd and glittering chandeliers, their innocent laughter felt like sunlight spilling into a cold room. Across the ballroom, Eli Ashbourne stood near the stage, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal gray suit. At 36, the CEO of Ashbourne Biolabs was known for his brilliance, his quiet philanthropy, and his mysterious, carefully guarded personal life. He had just finished his brief speech, words of gratitude, charity, and second chances, and was now enjoying a rare pause, a glass of champagne in hand. Then he saw them. 2 little girls in pink dresses. Blonde. About 4 years old. For a moment, his world stopped moving. The sound of music and chatter fell away, replaced by the slow thud of his own heartbeat. The sight of them hit him like a forgotten dream, those faces, those eyes, that familiar way one girl clung to the other. They looked like her. Like Isla. His late wife's eyes. Her same softness. Her same smile when she was deep in thought. And around their tiny necks glimmered silver pendants, the falling leaf design he would know anywhere. He had commissioned those himself before the twins were born. Only 2 existed in the world. Eli's breath caught. He blinked hard, thinking he must be seeing ghosts. But no, ghosts didn't laugh, or twirl in pink tulle, or offer strangers cookies. He set down his glass and crossed the room before he could think twice. The twins looked up as he approached, unafraid. Lyra was the first to speak, bold and curious as ever. "Hi," she chirped, her voice bright as bells. Eli knelt instinctively to meet her eye level. Her shoelace was untied. Without thinking, he crouched lower and began to tie it. As he did, her small hand brushed his, and something electric moved through him, a pulse of recognition too deep to name. Then she spoke again, matter-of-factly. "You smell like my bedtime pillow." Eli froze, his fingers trembling. He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting her wide, unguarded eyes. For a breath, he couldn't move. He saw Isla there, his wife Spark, his own reflection, all in this tiny stranger. The air around him thickened, and he whispered without realizing, God. Just then, Sandra turned from where she'd been adjusting a client's suit. She noticed the tall man crouched beside her daughters and hurried forward, her tone polite but protective. I'm sorry, are they in your way? Eli straightened, forcing his heartbeat to steady. Not at all, he replied softly, his voice strained but kind. They're lovely. Sandra smiled faintly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Thank you. They're my daughter. Twins? He asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, she said, her tone gentle but cautious. He swallowed hard. They remind me of someone I once knew. For a moment, they stood there, two strangers with a silence that felt heavier than words. Then Sandra called her girls back, and they came running, dresses swaying, curls bouncing, silver pendants catching the light. Eli watched them retreat to their mother's side, laughter echoing softly. And in that instant, he knew. They weren't strangers. They were his. That night, Eli didn't sleep. Back in his penthouse overlooking the glittering city, he sat by the window, replaying the evening in his mind, the way the girls moved, the necklaces, the sound of their laughter. He'd buried those sounds long ago. He'd buried them. He remembered their names as if saying them could bring them back. Aria and Lyra. The twins he had mourned 4 years ago. The ones he believed had perished in the fire that destroyed his world. But now, something in him refused to believe that lie any longer. He spent the entire night combing through event photos online, desperate for proof. At last, in one candid snapshot taken near the ballroom's edge, he saw it, the sign behind them, Thread of Grace. Below it, faint but visible, Sandra Whitlow, tailor and dressmaker. Eli's chest tightened. He didn't wait for morning. 2 hours later, his car sliced through fog and sleet, headlights cutting a path through the lonely Oregon countryside. His pulse thundered with something he hadn't felt in years, hope, raw and reckless. The world outside was dark and still when he reached the small town of Rosehill. There it was. The little shop between the flower store and the diner. Ivy crept up its stone walls. The front window glowed faintly with the warmth of a lamp. He parked across the street, sat for a moment, and exhaled a shaky breath. Then he stepped out, his shoes crunching on the frosty pavement. Inside, Sandra was sweeping again, her hair loosely tied, the faint scent of lavender and thread in the air. The bell above the door hadn't chimed yet, but she felt a presence, like the air itself had shifted. Then came a knock. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Behind her, Aria and Lyra looked up from their patchwork game on the floor, curious. When Sandra opened the door, her breath hitched. There he stood, the man from the gala. Tall, poised, yet with a weariness in his eyes that softened everything about him. Lyra whispered, tugging her sister's hand. Mommy, it's the vest man. Aria giggled, he looks like he came from a storybook. Sandra's brows drew together. Mr. Ashbourne, how? He smiled faintly, removing his hat, voice low and steady. I hope I'm not intruding. I'm in need of a suit for an upcoming conference, and you were the first person who came to mind. Her instinct told her there was more behind his words, but politeness won. She stepped aside. Please, come in. The shop was cozy, glowing softly from the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. Finished dresses hung neatly on the racks, sketches were pinned along the walls beside childish crayon drawings. Eli stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on the twins, who now sat cross-legged near his feet, coloring on scraps of fabric. Lyra looked up, proudly holding a sheet of paper covered in purple scribbles. This is you, she said with a grin, in Mommy's wedding dress. Sandra's face turned crimson. Lyra, she gasped, mortified. Eli laughed, an honest, unguarded sound that warmed the air. Well, he said lightly, placing a hand over his chest, If wearing a wedding dress means I get to meet two princesses like you, I won't complain. Sandra's laughter joined his, shy but genuine. Then she began her work, taking his measurements with quiet focus. Her hands brushed the fabric of his sleeve, and she noticed his gaze linger, not on her, but on the girls. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't amusement. It was longing. And something that looked very much like recognition. That night, long after Eli had left the shop, the wind returned to whisper against the frosted window panes. Upstairs, Aria and Lyra were fast asleep, their matching silver necklaces glinting faintly in the lamplight. The rhythmic sound of their breathing filled the quiet apartment above the shop. Sandra sat by her sewing table, staring at the half-finished hem in her lap. The needle paused mid-stitch. Her mind was still on him, the man who had walked through her door like a ghost wearing kindness. There was something in his eyes she couldn't shake. Not admiration. Not pity. Something older. Sadder. Like recognition buried deep in his bones. She rose quietly, crossed the room, and opened the top drawer of her wooden chest. Inside, beneath a stack of folded fabric, lay the photograph she had guarded for years. The torn picture. She held it up under the warm glow of her desk lamp. The half-smile of a young woman stared back, familiar, but she could never place where she'd seen it before. Then her gaze dropped to the edge of the torn paper, and her breath caught. There, just visible, was the outline of another figure. Shoulders in a dark suit. A man's hand resting on the woman's. It wasn't complete. But tonight, that faint shadow looked hauntingly like Eli. Her fingers trembled. It can't be. Her pulse quickened as she sat down at her desk, pulling her old laptop closer. She typed slowly, the keys echoing in the quiet. Ashbourne family fire, twins, missing. Dozens of headlines flooded the screen. Tragedy strikes Ashbourne estate, infant twins feared dead. Biotech heir loses family in mysterious blaze. Private security under investigation in fatal fire. Sandra's blood ran cold. Photo after photo appeared, Eli's younger face, smiling beside a beautiful woman whose features mirrored the torn image in her hands. Eli Ashbourne. His wife. Dozens of headlines flooded the screen. Tragedy strikes Ashbourne estate, infant twins feared dead. Biotech heir loses family in mysterious blaze. Private security under investigation in fatal fire. Sandra's blood ran cold. Photo after photo appeared, Eli's younger face, smiling beside a beautiful woman whose features mirrored the torn image in her hands. Eli Ashbourne. His wife. The woman in the picture. The rest of the pieces fell into place all at once, like a storm she couldn't stop. The silver leaf pendants. The purple velvet blankets. The identical eyes. Aria. Lyra. Her heart thudded painfully. If they were his, then who left them in the snow? And why had no one ever come for them? She looked down at the sleeping girls, their chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. They were safe. They were hers. But the world beneath her feet no longer felt steady. Sandra closed the laptop slowly, her reflection trembling in the dark screen. What have I brought into our lives? The words slipped out, soft but full of fear. At first, she tried to tell herself it was a coincidence. The way Eli looked at them. The way they responded to him instinctively, as if they had always known him. But then came the signs she couldn't ignore. A few days later, muddy footprints appeared on her porch, large ones, deep in the melting snow. They led to her front door, then vanished, as though whoever had been there had melted into the shadows. Sandra brushed them off as a delivery mistake, but her heart whispered otherwise. Then one evening, as she left the grocery store with the twins in tow, she felt it, a presence behind her. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. She turned sharply, clutching Aria's hand. Nothing. Just the rattle of an empty cart drifting in the wind. Still, unease crept up her spine like ice. That night, she double-checked the locks twice, then 3 times. The twins were fast asleep, their arms draped across each other. Sandra sat awake beside their bed, listening to every creak, every gust. The world outside was silent, but her instincts screamed otherwise. And then, one stormy night, her fear finally took shape. Rain hammered against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. Sandra sat downstairs, stitching quietly under the soft hum of her sewing lamp. It was the only sound in the room, the steady rhythm of thread through fabric. Until it wasn't. Crash. A deafening shatter of glass ripped through the air. Sandra gasped, the sewing needle dropping from her hand. She turned toward the front of the shop. Her display window was in pieces, glass glittering across the floor like ice shards. Her breath came fast. In the chaos, her eyes caught movement outside, a dark figure vanishing into the rain-soaked night. She ran to the door, snatching the heavy fabric shears from her table. But by the time she reached the threshold, whoever it was had disappeared into the storm. Then she saw it, red paint dripping down the wall beside the door. Scrawled in jagged letters, "Don't dig up the past." The shears slipped from her hand. Her body shook as she backed away, heart pounding against her ribs. She turned and bolted up the stairs, every step echoing like a gunshot. The twins were sitting up in bed, crying, frightened by the noise. Sandra rushed to them, gathering both girls into her trembling arms. "Shoo, it's okay. Mommy's got you." She whispered it over and over, though her own voice quivered with terror. Outside, lightning flashed, painting the world in brief white light. But the real storm was inside her, the awful realization that someone knew. Someone didn't want the truth to surface. The next morning, just as Sandra finished sweeping the shards of glass from the floor, the bell above the door rang sharply. She looked up, and froze. Eli stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his face pale with concern. He must have driven straight from the city. "I saw the article," he said, voice tight. "About the break-in. Are you hurt?" Sandra hesitated. She wanted to sound calm, in control. But the bandage around her hand gave her away. "It's nothing," she said softly. "Just a cut." Eli's expression darkened. He stepped closer, taking her wrist gently but firmly. "That's not nothing," he said, kneeling as he pulled a handkerchief from his coat pocket. With careful precision, he rewrapped the wound himself. His hands trembled, though he tried to hide it. "You need protection," he murmured. Sandra shook her head. "I can't afford." "You don't have to," he interrupted quietly. "I'll take care of it." There was no room for argument in his tone. By nightfall, a black SUV with tinted windows was parked discreetly across the street. 2 security guards took shifts, watching the perimeter. Aria and Lyra waved to them from the window, thinking it was all a game. But Eli didn't leave. He stayed, sometimes inside the shop, sometimes in his car parked nearby. Always close. Always watching over them. And little by little, his presence became part of their rhythm. He braided Aria's hair one morning, clumsy at first, but patient. She giggled the whole time. Lyra taught him how to make pancakes shaped like bears, her laughter filling the kitchen. Sandra watched it unfold quietly, an ache swelling in her chest. There was no pretending in the way he looked at them. No hesitation in how naturally they reached for him. She knew it now, the truth she'd tried to ignore. No man could fake that kind of love. The days that followed felt suspended, quiet, fragile, like the moment between breaths. Eli's presence had become almost routine now. He arrived early, sometimes bringing coffee for Sandra and little treats for the twins. By evening, he would sit near the sewing table, listening to the soft hum of her machine while the girls played nearby. Yet beneath that gentle rhythm, something stirred, a question neither of them dared to ask. One night, after the twins had gone to bed, the storm outside softened to a misty drizzle. The air smelled faintly of rain and lavender thread. Sandra poured 2 cups of chamomile tea and set them on the work table. Eli looked up, his expression weary. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying a burden too long alone. Sandra sat across from him, her voice quiet but firm. It's time, isn't it? For you to tell me what you're really looking for. Eli's gaze dropped to his hands. The steam from the tea rose between them like ghosts. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, with a trembling breath, he began. Her name was Isla, he said softly. My wife. Sandra didn't move, afraid even her breath would break the moment. She died 2 months after giving birth. Complications, the doctors said. I lost her before I even had a chance to heal. And after that, I barely held myself together. His voice cracked, the raw grief still living in every syllable. The twins were all I had left of her. My reason to keep breathing. He swallowed hard, staring at the table as if he could see the past replaying on its surface. Then, the fire. The words hung heavy in the air. It started in the nursery, he continued. They said it was an electrical fault. Faulty wiring. I wasn't home. By the time I got there, the house was engulfed. He paused, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening. They found almost nothing. Just ashes. They said there wasn't enough left to bury. He drew in a deep, unsteady breath. So I buried 2 empty coffins. The silence that followed was unbearable. The clock on the wall ticked, indifferent to the weight of what he'd said. Sandra's throat tightened. She could see it now, the shadow behind his eyes, the way he looked at her girls with reverence and ache, as though he was watching ghosts learn to breathe again. Without a word, she rose and went to the old cabinet by the wall. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a small laminated photograph, the one she had kept hidden for years. Her fingers trembled as she handed it to him. Eli took it slowly. His breath hitched as he turned it over. The torn half he'd thought was lost, now complete. There he was, younger, smiling beside Isla, her pregnant belly cradled in his arms. He pressed a hand to his mouth, his shoulders shaking. On the back of the photo, faded ink still lingered. For the one who finds them. The rest was too smudged to read, but it didn't matter. The truth spoke louder than words. Sandra's voice quivered as she said. I think they were meant to find you again. But maybe, they were meant to find me first. Eli looked up then, eyes glistening, and for the first time, there was no wall between them, only grief, and gratitude, and something that felt dangerously close to love. The silence that followed was not empty. It was healing. The following days blurred into a haze of quiet waiting, paperwork, hushed conversations, tests. When the envelope finally arrived, Sandra held it for a long moment before opening it. Her hand shook as she passed it to Eli. He tore the seal slowly, his pulse loud in his ears. One look at the letter inside was all it took. DNA confirmed, parental match. His hands trembled. He didn't speak. Instead, he looked up, at Sandra, at the girls laughing across the room, and his eyes said everything words could not. The weight of 4 years lifted, though the scar it left would never fade. But even as joy bloomed in his chest, another shadow followed close behind. Because if his daughters were alive, that meant someone had taken them, someone had wanted him to believe they were dead. The mystery that had haunted his nights was no longer buried beneath ash, it was rising, demanding truth. Eli couldn't rest. He spent hours in his study, tracing timelines, calling contacts, following trails he'd once been too broken to see. Each lead pointed toward a single name, Vincent Merrow. Once his closest friend and right hand at Ashbourne Biolabs, Vincent had been charming, brilliant, and ruthless. Years ago, Eli had caught him selling confidential research to competitors. He'd fired him immediately. Vincent vanished without a word. But now, the puzzle fit too perfectly to ignore. The fire had occurred only weeks after Isla's death, when Eli was at his weakest, drowning in grief. Vincent had known that. He had access to everything, the estate, the nursery, the security team. The deeper Eli dug, the darker it became. Security footage from that week, mysteriously wiped. The electrician who had repaired the nursery wiring, employed by a shell company tied to Vincent. The night guard who was supposed to be on duty, paid off to disappear. It all led back to one betrayal. Sandra, sensing his turmoil, joined him in the search. She remembered an old neighbor, Mr. Langley, who'd once mentioned having a doorbell camera around the time of the fire. Together, they visited him. The old man's hand shook as he rummaged through drawers, finally producing a battered flip phone. "Don't know if this thing even works anymore," he muttered, "but I think I saved something strange that night." They brought it to a technician in town. For 2 long days, they waited, sleepless and restless, hearts tight with anticipation. And then, the video appeared. Grainy. Flickering. But unmistakable. A tall man in a dark overcoat entered the Ashbourne estate late at night, glancing around before unlocking the gate with a key. He disappeared inside, then emerged minutes later carrying something small, wrapped in a blanket. He returned the next night. And this time, his face turned toward the camera, faintly lit by the glow of the porch light. A crooked smile. Cold eyes. Vincent Marrow. The timestamp read 3 days before the fire. Eli stood frozen, staring at the footage. His fists clenched, his voice breaking through the quiet like thunder. "He took them," he whispered. "He took my daughters, and let me believe they were dead." His voice was jagged, trembling with rage and grief. Sandra reached out, laying a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "Then take it back," she said softly. "Not with anger, with justice." Eli looked at her, really looked, and something steadied inside him. He nodded slowly. "Justice," he repeated. "For Isla. For them. For you." Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the window, whispering like the ghosts of the past finally ready to rest. Because now, the storm had a name. And Eli Ashbourne was done running from it. Just days after the footage surfaced, the quiet streets of Rosehill no longer felt the same. Reporters began to arrive, first one, then several, their cameras glinting like restless eyes. The world wanted the story. The fall of Vincent Marrow. The miracle of the Ashbourne twins. Eli didn't care about headlines. He cared about truth. Together, he and Sandra filed an official lawsuit against Vincent, charges of abduction, fraud, arson, and intimidation. The case sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets called it the Ashbourne resurrection. Headlines screamed across every channel. Twins thought dead found alive after 4 years. CEO's former partner behind kidnapping plot. Unsung seamstress saved lost heiresses. But for Sandra, the noise outside meant little. Her focus was on keeping Aria and Lyra safe. The girls were too young to understand the chaos swirling around them, and she was determined to shield them from it. Eli, meanwhile, moved like a man on a mission. Every meeting with his lawyers, every late-night strategy call, was fueled by the same purpose, to reclaim what had been stolen, not just his children, but the truth. And then came the day the court opened its doors. The room was packed, journalists, cameras, strangers with curiosity in their eyes. Sandra sat quietly in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Eli stood tall beside his attorney, composed on the outside, though his heart thundered beneath his calm exterior. Across the aisle sat Vincent Marrow, once a man of charm and confidence. Now, he looked hollow, his suit impeccable, but his eyes restless, darting, afraid. The trial began with the video, the footage from the old phone. The moment Vincent's face flickered across the screen, a hush fell over the courtroom. There was no denying it. No more lies to hide behind. Eli's knuckles whitened on the table. Sandra's breath came slow and steady. Then came the witnesses. A retired nurse named Miriam Brooks took the stand. Her hands trembled as she confessed everything, how Vincent had approached her under false pretenses the night of the fire, claiming there was an emergency and the twins needed to be moved for their safety. "I believed him," she whispered through tears. "He said it was to protect them. I didn't know what he planned to do. I didn't know he'd leave them." Sandra pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the words like tiny fractures in her heart. But the moment that silenced even the loudest skeptics came next. Eli's attorney unfolded a sheet of paper, a letter written in Sandra's own hand, one she had never meant for the world to hear. Eli had found it tucked inside a box of the girl's old dresses, a letter she'd written years ago, on one of those nights when loneliness had crept too close. He stood, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "Before I say anything," he told the court, "I want you to hear the words of the woman who gave my daughters their lives twice over." He opened the letter and began to read aloud. "I didn't give birth to them. But from the first moment I held them, crying in the snow, they became flesh of my flesh. I sewed every dress they wore. I stayed awake through every fever, every bad dream. They called me Mama before they could even say my name. That is real. And if love makes a parent, then I am theirs, too." The courtroom was silent. Sandra sat frozen, tears gathering in her eyes. She hadn't known he'd kept that letter. She hadn't expected him to share it with the world. But as she looked toward Eli, his voice steady, his expression filled with reverence, she realized something. This wasn't exposure. This was honor. He wasn't taking her story, he was giving it the place it deserved. Later that afternoon, the court recessed for a brief break. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones raised, flashes popping. Eli faced them calmly, his hand resting protectively at Sandra's back. "My daughters were stolen," he said simply. "And for years I believed they were gone. But they were found, not by luck, but by love. By a woman with no reason to take them in, and every reason to let them go. She didn't." He paused, glancing toward Sandra. "So if there's a hero in this story, it isn't me. It's her." Sandra lowered her eyes, her heart full and fragile all at once. Back inside, the final testimonies unfolded. And then came the moment that broke every heart in the room. A pre-recorded video began to play on the courtroom screen. Two little girls appeared, sitting side by side on their bed in matching pink dresses. Their blonde curls shimmered in the light, their hands clasped tightly together. Aria spoke first, her voice small but clear. "We don't want to go anywhere." Lyra nodded quickly beside her. "Mommy loves us." Aria smiled softly, finishing the thought. "Daddy loves us now, too. We want to stay with Mommy and Daddy." Even the judge's eyes glistened. That single moment ended every argument. The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that feels sacred, where truth no longer needs proof. When the verdict was finally read, it felt less like victory and more like release. Vincent Merrow, guilty on all counts. Bail denied. Sentence pending. As the gavel struck, a wave of emotion rippled through the room. Eli exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Sandra sat motionless, her fingers pressed to her lips, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude. It was over. But in truth, it was only just beginning. That evening, when Sandra returned to her shop, she found something unexpected waiting on her sewing table, a wooden box tied with twine, and a note resting beside it in Eli's handwriting. For the woman who stitched a broken world back together. Her hands trembled as she untied the bow and lifted the lid. Inside lay an old sewing machine, the same model her late mother had once owned, the one Sandra had lost years ago when the gears had rusted beyond repair. Now it gleamed like new, polished, restored, loved. But what made her breath hitch was the small brass nameplate fixed to the front. Ellison and Whitlow Atelier, where love begins, one stitch at a time. Sandra pressed her hand over her mouth, tears spilling freely. Behind her, the door creaked open. Eli stood there, uncertain. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Sandra walked straight into his arms, her head resting against his chest as if it had always belonged there. For the first time, there were no secrets, no fear, only peace. This wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a family finally made whole. A year passed. The town of Rosehill had changed little, but for the Whitlow home above Thread of Grace, everything was new. The sign over the shop door now read, "Sandra and Daughters." and below it, in elegant cursive, the original name remained. Thread of Grace. It was her reminder. A promise. The night everything began was no longer a wound, it was a thread connecting every miracle since. Inside, laughter spilled through the sunlit windows. It was Saturday, the day the shop transformed into a little classroom. Sandra's once quiet sewing room now buzzed with tiny voices and fluttering ribbons. Every weekend, she opened her doors to children from the local orphanage, little girls who came to learn how to stitch, hem, and patch. She taught them not just to sew fabric, but to mend what was broken, with patience, love, and gentle hands. It was her way of giving back what life had given her, second chances. But today wasn't an ordinary class. Outside, in the small garden behind the shop, pink streamers danced in the soft breeze. A long wooden table stood beneath the oak tree, covered in cupcakes, paper crowns, and strawberry punch. A cake shaped like an old sewing machine sat proudly at the center, decorated with two tiny edible dolls perched on top. It was Aria and Lyra's 5th birthday. The twins twirled in matching blush dresses dotted with embroidered flowers. Frosting smudged their noses, their laughter echoing through the afternoon air. Sandra stood nearby, wiping her hands on her apron, heart full as she watched them run through the grass. They were the light she never saw coming, and now, her whole world revolved around their giggles. "Make a wish, my loves," she called out, clapping as everyone gathered around. 2 candles flickered on the cake. The girls squeezed their eyes shut, whispered their wishes, and blew, twin flames vanishing in perfect harmony. The guests cheered. Music played. For a while, it felt like joy itself lived in that little garden. As evening settled and the last guests drifted away, Sandra began clearing the table, humming softly to herself. The garden lights twinkled above, and the air carried the faint scent of roses and sugar. She was stacking plates when she heard it, the soft patter of small, bare feet on the grass. "Mommy!" She turned. Aria and Lyra stood there, still barefoot, their flower crowns askew, faces glowing from the day's excitement. Each held one of Eli's hands. He stood behind them, smiling quietly, that same tender, almost shy smile that had become her favorite thing to see. Aria stepped forward, clutching something small wrapped in velvet. "This is for you," she said solemnly. Sandra frowned playfully. "For me? What's this about?" Lyra grinned wide. "Daddy said you're the thread that kept him from falling apart." Sandra blinked, her heart catching in her throat. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the little box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a ring, simple, delicate, with a single stone at its center. But what made her breath hitch wasn't the sparkle, it was the engraving inside the band. "Stitched by Grace." When she looked up, Eli was already kneeling before her. The soft light from the string bulbs above caught the glimmer of tears in his eyes. "I don't have a speech," he said quietly. "Just this truth, you held all 3 of us together when you didn't have to. You sewed our broken hearts back into something whole." He took her trembling hand in his. "If you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life stitching every day beside you." Sandra couldn't speak. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her lips trembling as she nodded, laughing through her sobs. The twins squealed in delight, jumping and clapping, their laughter breaking into the night like fireworks. Eli stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into his arms. For the first time in years, there was no loss to remember, no past to mourn, only the sweet, quiet peace of belonging. Later that night, when the house was still and the twins were asleep upstairs, Eli found Sandra in her sewing room. She was standing by the desk, a small envelope in her hands. "What's that?" he asked softly. She turned the photo toward him. It was the old torn picture, now whole, mended with clear tape. On one side, Isla smiled, holding 2 swaddled infants. On the other, Eli, younger, full of hope, stood with his arm around her. Together, they looked like a promise never meant to fade. Sandra traced the edge of the photo gently. On the back, faint handwriting still bled through the paper. For the one who finds them, please love them like we do. Eli Ashbourne. Sandra's breath shook as she whispered. I think she'd be happy. Eli smiled faintly, placing a kiss on her forehead. I know she would. He took her hand and led her to the porch. Outside, the night was calm. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled glitter. The air was cool, quiet, full of peace. They sat side by side on the old wooden steps. Aria and Lyra, half asleep, had snuck out moments later and curled up between them, little heads resting on Sandra's lap, their fingers twined together. Eli wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring, the one that bore the words she had once whispered in the dark. Stitched by Grace. For a while, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The wind carried laughter from earlier, the faint echo of the twins' giggles, the hum of life moving gently forward. Sandra leaned her head on Eli's shoulder, her voice soft as a prayer. We made it through the storm. Eli's hand tightened around hers. And found our way home. The stars above shimmered quietly, and for the first time in years, the night felt whole, a family mended by love, faith, and the simple strength of one woman's heart. They had been stitched together, not by chance, but by grace.